I called this presentation Something from Nothing, because what I am really asking students to do thematically is to observe and reflect and create on the theme of how to do nothing. And how to do nothing is not my idea. It's the title of a book from Jenny Odell, but we take it and we spin it in a few different ways, which I'll show you. So the things I like about this exercise or this set of exercises is that it involves a lot of observation and documentation, something that I feel like can apply in a number of different courses and subjects. It helps, I think, build community. I started doing this, I started thinking about these ideas pre-COVID, but I really started to implement this as an exercise while we were teaching online, and it seemed to really help with that. And then since I've been back on campus, it seems that students only want that even more, right? They're craving that community even more. So I think there are ways to build on these things and continue doing them. And then the last thing I like about it is the reflective learning aspect. It lets students reflect on their work and each other's work in this long-term process. So how to do nothing, and in the process, make something. I'm going to start with giving you a little background and context. I will go through some examples and give a description of how I piloted this project in a few different classes. As I go, I'll maybe bring in some suggestions or modifications that I might do if I were to do it again. And then I want to leave a lot of time for discussion and question and answer, because I think that's probably the most exciting part. So background, I started reading this book during COVID, and it was called How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. The basic idea of the book is that there are so many things competing for our attention, and particularly a lot of those being digital things like social media, the sort of nefarious design, or however you want to put it, of a lot of these apps and websites and things like that kind of suck us in. So how to get away from that. The funny part about the book is that I got distracted and I never ended up finishing it, which is a bit ironic. But so rather than use the book as the starting point, I use actually an article. And there's a few reasons why I like to use the article. One, there's a keynote talk that accompanies it, so students can listen and watch as opposed to read. And I feel like having that multimodal approach helps. And then the second thing I like about it is it has tons of images and art examples. So if you're teaching art and design students, it can be really useful. I mean, even if you're not teaching art and design students, I think it can be really useful just to have some visual examples, which the book refers to, does not include. So some of those visual things that Jenny Odell talks about, well, she really talks about any kind of art or any kind of practice that focuses your attention on something and that takes you away from the distraction and towards a certain type of observation. So she'll bring in visual examples like James Turrell, sitting and observing clouds. She'll bring in practices like walking through a garden or walking through a labyrinth. She spends a lot of time in a garden. She talks about bird watching, or as she calls it, bird noticing. And she talks about deep listening. So she brings in tons and tons of different examples of art and practice where observation is the goal, and being immersed in what you're doing is the goal. So I use that as a starting point, and we have a conversation a bit. Another issue that she talks about is the way that we can learn from each other. That deep listening can help shift and change our point of view on things. So rather than just the separation between connectivity, where things are connected but not really engaged with, and sensitivity occurring over a duration where things can actually shift and change. So I used this in 2 classes. The first was an integrative seminar class, which is a first-year required class in Parsons ADHD. And then the second was an elective that I teach in visual culture called NYC Zine Culture, where they read about and make and create zines. So I adapted this in a few different ways in both of those classes, as you'll see. So step by step, this is what I did. I had students create entries. I had them just go around and observe and post whatever they saw. So this took place over time. I had them post 5 entries a week for 5 weeks, and I asked them to do it not like 5 all at once, but to try to space it out 5, one a day. I gave prompts. So for the first year seminar class, every entry had to start with "today I noticed," and then be accompanied by some sort of visualization. For the zine class, we read a little bit more about mapping and geography in addition to how to do nothing. So it was more about mapping some kind of a space. They knew at the end they were going to make a zine with that documentation too. So some of them mapped their rooms, some of them mapped their block, some of them mapped this sort of chaotic interiority of their minds. But that was the way that it was focused in each class. Step 2 was giving feedback. So each week they were invited to look at each other's work. We organized them in shared Google Drive folders. So to look at work and then add comments to a feedback document for each other. And that way they could reflect on what they were doing, reflect on what each other were doing, and then do something with that, finalize that. I should also point out that they did different things from week to week. They could switch it up a little bit. So it was a bit of trying to create a routine and a structure, I think particularly important in online learning COVID times, but also that they were allowed to deviate from that. So for the integrative seminar folks, their final outcome was a reflection on the process. So kind of the doing the work was the main goal, and then reflecting on what shifted and changed and what they noticed was the last part of it. Again, for the zine students, they were creating a zine that was synthesizing or reworking the data that they had been accumulating. So submitting entries, I asked them again to submit to a shared folder. The entries can be random, thematic, physical, digital, and I asked people to do them every day so that it became part of a routine. This is an example for the first year seminar. So this was a student, each week created an illustration and accompanied it with a small sentence. This was, on the day that, I don't know if you all remember when it took, 100 years to find out the election results. And so she was there documenting that. In another week, you can see she switched up the style of the illustrations and the way that she's writing the text. So they're very kind of small and sometimes seemingly insignificant kind of entries. Again, the goal was just to do something every day and kind of build up a practice, right? This is another example from that same class, noticing different things, clearly creating some kind of a color story. This is another week in that same student's reflection, noticing a Louisiana-shaped pita chip in the middle there. So fun little random things. And what I noticed about this was that they had the opportunity to share with each other. So this was a fully online class. They're in different parts of the country and the world, but they're getting to show each other slices of each other's life and reflect on where they are themselves, right? Like kind of going through your junk drawers and looking through all the stuff that you've got and making some sense of it, getting to, see each other's cats, exploring in your own city and kind of showcasing that to people as well. So I figured, wherever they are, they can use that and share that with one another. For the zine students, they were mapping a space. I did ask them to reflect in the moment. So each week I asked them to add a short paragraph describing what did you notice, how did you notice, what did that look like for you? So this student was, she wanted to map again her city block. So she would walk around and she would do images, writing, video, sound recordings. This was another student that was in the process of moving, and that's what she ended up creating her final zine about, was moving apartments. And so it was photo documentations, or there was layout, charts like IKEA receipts, stuff like that from week to week. And then for giving feedback, there's a million different ways to do this. The way that I ended up doing it was each person had a Google Doc in their folder and people would add commentary. So by the end, you could kind of scroll through and you have this kind of living collection of comments. So for example, for this student, in her document, people left her comments. Someone said, oh, I was also in Washington Square Park that day. So they could find kind of commonalities. I asked them to be really specific about what they liked and to also talk about what it reminded them of. So people would share, this book or, this other thing. This student was talking about, like, I spend all my money on coffee. I think coffee was part of one of the reflections that week. So, finding some common bonds, visually commenting on the style, just kind of really getting to know each other. I really wasn't expecting the commentary to be so rich and detailed as it was. But it seems like they had that time to, it felt kind of fun, like looking through each other's photos and looking through each other's folders. It felt like a closeness that they weren't otherwise getting. So I was really pleased with that. And of course, as a student, to have, all of that data accumulated was really cool. So then do it over and over again, right? So they had to do this for 5 weeks. I think that could be tough for some students, but I hope that it got them into a routine. Obviously you had, for some students, it was hard to keep up or maintain that routine. And so we had some missing weeks here and there, missing comments, things like that. But the goal was to try to get a structure established and then keep it. I felt like 5 weeks was a good timeline for that. And then I asked them to reflect. So what did they notice over those 5 weeks, looking at each other's entries and, basically creating an essay that summarizes and synthesizes that whole experience. That was also unexpectedly powerful. There was a lot of cool stuff that came up. The zine students, they went a different route, and instead of writing a reflective essay, they created a zine. So this student was mapping her apartment, created a zine called Displacement, where she's mapping and creating keys and guides to all of the different things that she found. She had all these rubber stamps, so she was using those. And just to backtrack and show you what her documentation process was like, it would vary from week to week. So she would take pictures of the same spot every day, 1 week, all of her lists and all of her notes and all of the things that she was doing for class. 1 week was all about her cat. And so she mapped her cat's trajectory across her desk. So, they got to basically experiment in all these different low stakes ways. And then kind of, they had the opportunity to either start fresh or zone in on a particular area that they liked in those 5 weeks and build on that. This student, the one I mentioned that was moving apartments, she was a photography major, so she was really photo heavy. And then she ended up layering all of these note cards and writing on top of that and told the story of her move in that way. And then this last one, this was an interesting one because she, her 5 weeks of documentation were totally different. She was like mapping her interior state of mind, a lot of highs and lows, ups and downs, really sort of moody Spotify playlists, all of this kind of stuff. So she had this sort of emotional experience that she was chronicling. But then at one point, she kind of landed on this weird basement space in her family's home where she was working at that time, and landed on that and ended up creating her zine about that. So it's called The Basement. She typed out the writing on a typewriter that she found down there, and that's the basis of that writing. And so she's mapping all of the different odd things that are happening in that space. There's this conversation that she's having with her mom that she's illustrating and typing out. She's, drawing all of the, old board games and laundry detergent and like weird old TVs that don't work and things like that, creating kind of an inventory. So it came together in that really interesting way. And then this was the whole thing as a whole. This was how they submitted it. Again, this class was fully online. So that was how she did it. And then I also asked them to write artist statements to describe what they're doing, how it all came together, stuff like that. So I think that's all I have for right now. But I'm going to pop out of here, take a look at the chat and see if we have questions.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much, Anya. And we'll just open it up. Please feel free to unmute.
Yeah, that was incredible, Anya. Sorry, I came late. I was in reviews, but what class was this and what level is this?
Yeah, so I ran it in a first year integrative seminar class, and then the other class is an elective called NYC Zine Culture. It's a 1000 level, but you end up having students take it. You have a lot of seniors take it. You have people at all levels taking it from a lot of different majors.
Yeah, that's amazing, really, really inspiring what you got out of them with that premise, right? Of to do nothing. I've been for years on this bend of trying to start projects or studios just with not doing anything but observing, right? That first way to change the world, we got to change our own, and we got to change it by noticing what's there and not superimposing. So I'm just absolutely thrilled to see the work and what these responses that you got from the students. How did the students respond to it, sort of in conversation and particularly in the beginning? I mean, did they think it was strange what you were asking them, or?
That's a great question. Thank you, Alfred, and thanks for your comments. I think it was a mix. I think, obviously it was like deep COVID times. And so a lot of them were feeling super low and super down and super like there wasn't anything interesting or good happening in their lives. So I feel like you have to consider that. But I think that no one really responded negatively. And I think actually they felt often like they would share. I didn't ask them to share anything super deep or personal, but a lot of them did because it felt like sort of a diary or an outlet. And that was how some of the students chose to approach it. And then others, I think, maybe had the sense that it felt like a bit mundane or rote, like they weren't really sure and they were trying to work it out. But the ones that stuck with it, and again, I think there were some people that really had a hard time keeping and establishing a routine. But the ones that stuck with it often found that after a week or two, they kind of settled into a rhythm or they found ways to play with it. So usually, by week 5, they were feeling like they were able to make it their own. So I would try to give some comments every week about what I thought was cool, maybe how you might try to switch it up or do something differently. I think one thing that they really, really loved was getting to just look at each other's work and give feedback and get feedback, like a little present. So I would definitely keep that if I were to run it again, I would keep that for sure. Again, you can play with the different ways that you ask them to give and receive feedback. I think I would have them bring it up in class if they wanted to, but I tried to minimize that because sometimes it was just so personal that I didn't think they necessarily wanted to talk about it with everybody, even though they were like putting it in their folder to be looked at. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm curious that you haven't persisted with the practice because it is so rich and built such deep connections that I'm wondering what you think might be some of the challenges of incorporating it now that we've returned to in-person teaching.
Yeah, thanks, Rita. I think the big thing is just everybody's everywhere. I feel like I capitalized on the fact that everybody was kind of stuck in one place. And now, we're all getting on the train and commuting and taking trips and all of those things. However, I still feel, in actually getting all of these images and slides together, I came back around to it and thought like, oh, I really should do this again, because I think it really is helpful. And I think one other thing to think about is the kind of generational aspect of it, or how do people, because I think the reading isn't really neutral. I think people respond to it in different ways. And there was an essay that I had read in the New Yorker not too long ago by Cal Newport about quiet quitting. You all know that phenomenon. And he was writing about the generational difference between the millennial mindset of work being your life and your values and this sort of ideal representation of your inner self versus a Gen Z mindset, which sees these things, which doesn't really basically that there's a generational shift in how people perceive work and how people perceive their practice. So in reading that, I started to shy away from using the Jenny Odell reading. And I think the other thing that's interesting is there will be comments like how to do nothing, and people will think, well, I want to do something, right? I want to change the world. I want to make a big difference. So I don't want to read something called How to Do Nothing. Obviously, I would say you need to read it a little more closely, because that's not really the point. So I think you have to do a close reading and a careful reading of it to get to that. But I think the last thing is that to do something big, it's just doing small things over and over again, right? And that's, I think, what the project kind of teaches is it's the little experiments and small stakes things that are important. So
yeah, I actually think you can do it. I think you can do it without the reading. It's a practice, and I think it's a great practice for incoming freshmen, for first year students. And that small little prompt. Today I noticed, that's really powerful. And to get that your idea of making it a habit, I wondered if at the end of the 5 weeks, some students wanted to persist.
I hadn't noticed that, but that would be a good thing to try again, ask and see. I'm also remembering that there was one semester that I did it, and then I had them, my studio partner and I had them kind of cannibalize each other's images and make a zine out of that. So they got to really take each other's work and do things with it. So I do think there's a lot of possibilities for, can you build on it, and can you take this data that you all accumulate and kind of crowdsource it together and make something with it.
Yeah, I agree with Rita, right? It's all, I think it is a practice. And I started, it was still in the pandemic, but I was able to work outside of where I lived. And I at one point shared it with my students. I said, every day on my way, when I leave the house, if I go to school or somewhere else, I try to notice something that's awesome. Just one thing every day in those 15, 20 minutes or however long it would take me to commute. And I would share it. I would try to get students to, I would canvas and start the class that way. Did anybody notice anything awesome today? And I didn't get a lot of traction, but for me, it was much more sporadic now. But if I'm really present, I do it, and it is amazing. It's amazing. Sorry, I'm using that same word there, but yeah, we just observe and make it a practice to notice the small things, right? We're so inundated with these big disasters, all the negative news, but there's plenty of things to, I'm looking out here, watching the way that the sunlight is hitting something, or so, yeah. I'm so thrilled to see the student work and that what you did with that. So it's really inspiring. And it makes me think I want to again deepen my own practice and think about how to engage students in that way again, right? But you're right. I think with the text, maybe, and as Rita was saying too, maybe you don't need actually the text right up front there. Maybe you can get them going and then later introduce the text and say this is where the inspiration comes from.
Any last observations, since we're talking about observation?
I really appreciate your presentation, Anya. I really enjoyed it, and I've been meaning to read that book and haven't gotten to it. So now I feel excited at least to read the keynote sort of transcript. But I really find that point interesting about how different people see that title of how to do nothing, and maybe another title that might work for younger folks is something like how to see deeply, or how to refine your perception, or we can think of lots of other names for it, but it's kind of interesting how that title hits different for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think maybe it's like a pressure of feeling like I'm here and I have to do all these big, amazing things. There could be a positive type of anxiety associated with that title. So I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with it. But yeah, I agree. Like you could definitely frame this exercise in different ways. And obviously the core of it, the observation and the practice, is like what we want students to build for sure.
We are at time. Thank you so much. This was really, really inspiring. I think both in terms of, our own practice of teachers, and then our own lives. So thank you so much. Will you share the PowerPoint so that we can share it with participants?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming.